Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the War of Rebellion podcast for Age Civil War. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn, and I had a wonderful day doing battlefield tours with students today, so I'm looking forward to give this day a nice ending with a conversation about a really interesting book today. And I just realized I didn't ask how to pronounce my guest's last name.
It's Zacek.
Zacek. All right. I am joined by Natalie Zacek from the UK in Manchester, where she is a professor of history, and she has a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. So she is American background, but she came to the UK to teach American history, Caribbean history, I think, too, because her first book was settler societies in the English Leeward Islands, 1670 to 1776, which is also a prize-winning book because it got the Gladstone Prize. I assume that's 19th century Gladstone, right?
Um, I believe it is. It's a prize given by the Royal Historical Society of the UK for the first book by someone in the UK academic community that isn't exclusively on the history of Britain. So they give it.
Okay,
I
cool.
assume it's named for former Prime Minister Gladstone, but I honestly, it's not the William Gladstone Prize, it's just Gladstone.
Yeah, well, you don't need his first name everywhere. But we're not going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about Thoroughbred Nation, making America at the racetrack, 1791 to 1900. I will admit, I kind of was the first when I saw the book and I was like, ooh, it's a 19th century title. I was not sure what to expect from it, and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
So I have to say that was a very different perspective to take. I am really curious the way you constructed it. So, first thing I always like to ask my guests is, how did you come to write a book about racing, horse racing?
Well, I grew up in Albany, New York. Uh,
Okay.
And about 20 miles away is the town of Saratoga Springs. And every August, Saratoga's racetrack opens. And unlike most US racetracks, which are kind of dilapidated, moribund, Saratoga is extremely lively, and many
Mm,
people go to the track who aren't necessarily particularly interested either in racing or even in gambling,
mm,
but they go because the group that runs the racetrack at Saratoga is very savvy about what they're selling. So they are selling top class horse sport, and they are selling the opportunity to wager on that sport, but they're also selling an idea of, sort of late 19th century Edith Whartonian genteel recreation. So while it's perfectly all right to go in jeans and a t-shirt and bring a
mm,
cool beer, most people, even the ones who are not, particularly wealthy or members of the club there, you do see a lot of men in linen suits, women
mm,
flowered dresses and big hats, people spending extra money to eat in the clubhouse and,
mm.
champagne or cocktails. And, it I realized, after thinking about it, that that really is why it has continued to be successful when so many American tracks, particularly in the past 30 years, have shut down or are only running races occasionally.
Mm.
And it made me think a bit about um, the 19th century when horse racing, up until really the last decades, when you start seeing so-called city games such as professional baseball and basketball, what were they selling? Were Americans really that much more excited about horses then? And of course, Americans were engaging with horses much more in their daily lives up to the end of the century, but plenty of people didn't particularly care about
Mm.
horses. They went because these were important social spaces. They were places in particular where a whole group of local elites, both before and after the Civil War, used racing and the social life around racing as a way to make a statement, either an accurate statement or a wish about what their community was all about compared to others.
Right. Now, I have to admit, when you talked about like the way people dress, I was still taken back to I was gosh, I think it was 2008 or 9 maybe. I was down in Southampton at the university, and I took the train. I think it was on a Sunday back to London, and there was an excursion train or something that came through, and all these fancily dressed, beautiful hats,
Probably
women.
Royal Ascot.
Yeah. It was beautiful, it was beautiful, but it's sort of like it reminded me exactly of sort of that kind of way of style that you have that you're talking about there at the racetracks.
And like Royal Ascot, Saratoga usually attracts a fair number of celebrities.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And so when I grew up, even though my family isn't horsey and none of my friends were, we definitely knew that in Saratoga, in the summer, not only would this normally kind of sleepy Victorian town be full of people, and there would be all the people who are very excited about racing, but there also would be various famous people, and then our local newspaper would have all these pictures, not just of the winning horses and jockeys or the horse owners, but also of, people who were very dressed up, some of whom were celebrities. And Mary Lou Whitney, of the New York Whitney family, who were some of the founders of Saratoga track in the 1890s. Mrs. Whitney threw a costume ball every year. And so you would see all the pictures of elite society people also crossing over with some of the celebrities in various outfits. And on the one hand, you could laugh at, some of them look pretty ridiculous, but
Mm-hmm.
actually raised a lot of money, mostly for the racetrack workers who tended to be Black and Latino and who don't earn a lot of money and are at risk of various injuries. So there was a sense not only of this elite socializing, and we don't really see costume balls in the US anymore, but Mrs. Whitney had them until she died about 15 years ago, and I think else has taken them over. But the idea that on the one hand this is glamorous hyper elite socializing, but at the same time there's a relationship between the community and the racetrack.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's wow. And I have to look that up. That sounds really fascinating to
I
see some
love
of those pictures.
you Sometimes it would be, fairy tales. Sometimes it would be, Versailles. They had all of these themes, and because she did it for decades, so she always had to come up with new themes.
Cool,
And
cool.
people took the costume bit very seriously, especially because they knew media would be there. I mean, even in a pre-social media era, you would see those pictures.
So like normally it's like when you have a paper when you have a book of this nature, the research process obviously allows you to kind of combine potentially something you're interested in that we would usually not consider part of a research, but in this case would be a research. So how many racetracks in these various places did you go to? Did you go to any races to kind of do some extra research, or like you started with that beautiful kind of anecdote with regard to 2000, I think 19 in Louisville. And were you one of those hundreds? What was it, 30,000,
Oh, and most
190,000
of the
people?
tracks I write about don't exist anymore. So Saratoga obviously does, and I haven't been to
Hmm.
Saratoga. I've been to the Kentucky Derby Museum, and I have been to the track, but not when they were running a race.
Okay.
And I never actually went to the Preakness Stakes at Pimlico, even though I was living in Baltimore
Hmm.
for my graduate work. And I actually, for reasons maybe we'll discuss later, don't like modern horse racing at all. I don't think it's
Okay.
proper sport. Um, so most of what I did is I did use a fair number of of personal papers at various archives, but a lot, I was able to read racing papers.
Hmm.
And particularly in the pre-Civil War era, there were two major sporting papers, and they had editors and writers, but they also took, there were, if you lived in Natchez, Mississippi, and went to the turf there, you would just write an account and send it off either under your own name or an amusing fake name,
Hmm.
so that people, around the US could read about what was going on at your track. So there really is the idea of,
Hmm.
a fellowship of people, mostly, though not exclusively, men.
Hmm.
And obviously they're interested in whatever track they can go to, but they also want to know what's going on at other tracks that they might never visit. And they also get accounts of racing in Britain,
Hmm.
in Ireland, on the continent of Europe, and anywhere else they can get someone to write up.
Wow.
There's very much a sense of turf men who might be men who
Hmm.
actually own or train horses, or they might just be guys that like racing.
Right. Yeah.
But are
Sure.
very much so it tended towards the upper middle classes, but I'm sure
Mhm.
there were some less elite people who liked to wager and who, would read these papers if they could get them.
Yeah. That's and it is a sad reality, I guess, on some levels that so many of the tracks that you do talk about aren't anymore or kind of like I think Baltimore is the one that you talk extensively in the introduction about of how it's like it's dated, it's in dire need of repair, and you like history has to make way for modern comforts.
And racing, I mean, people get excited about the big events like the Kentucky Derby,
Hmm.
but if you just want to bet, you starting in the 1970s, you could do off-track betting, so you didn't
Hmm.
actually physically go there. And most people don't grow up with horse racing. And they're just, I mean, even in the pre-internet era, there were just so many other things that people could do, and so many other sports that you could watch live or on television. And, horse racing, if to really know racing, I mean, you really have to know a lot. If you really want to engage with it, you have to know a lot about, horse anatomy and about how to
Hmm.
pace a horse. But, if you really want to be someone that knows, then you do have to do a lot about pedigrees and heritage. It's quite a high bar to reach in terms of really being
Hmm.
able to engage with it. And because the races are so quick now,
Hmm.
the average race is over in a few minutes. If you go to the toilet at the wrong time, you miss the whole thing.
Hmm.
So if you neither know a great deal about the history of racing, nor are you a gambler, there isn't really that much to see outside of the
Hmm.
really carnivalesque events like the Kentucky Derby.
Right.
A lot of people go either to dress up and socialize in a fancy way or just to get really drunk in the infield.
It's Kentucky, right? A lot of possibilities there. Yeah, and it's sort of when we lived in New Mexico, I remembered we had a casino and a racetrack, and like, we usually was like, gosh, when did it start? October, November. There was like 8 weeks, 9 weeks of racing, and then the whole circus moved on. The jockeys moved on to another city, and they did races there, and um,
And there's
yeah,
also a lot of concern now about animal welfare.
yeah, yeah.
So I think a lot of people dislike racing because they feel that, it's just not,
Hmm.
perhaps at a place like Saratoga where, they really are very careful about the animals'
Hmm.
well-being. And those are very, very expensive animals. You're not going to do the wrong thing on a horse that's worth $20 million.
Hmm.
Uh, but, a lot of the smaller tracks, they aren't necessarily able to provide for the horse's well-being. And a lot of people just feel that it's inherently, a cruel sport.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, but back to your book, I kind of enjoyed how you structured this because you kind of did a chronological approach, but through different places in different times. So did you kind of come to this naturally, or did it take you a little while to kind of figure out this is the right framework? How did you go about that?
It took me a long time of thinking about it. And I realized that it was a case of follow the money. I knew I
Mm,
would starting with Virginia because, even today, Virginians, love the image of their antecedents as cavaliers, and
mhm,
they really want to have bragging rights about this is where, high-end horse racing started in the United States long before the American Revolution.
mm,
Um, and then and they kind of struggle with South Carolina. And again, this is coastal Virginia, coastal South Carolina, the places that really think of themselves as the aristocratic parts
mhm,
of America. And then moving, with population and money, and particularly, in the chapters that are antebellum, by the time of the Civil War, Virginia is really kind of spent. Even
mhm,
early in the 19th century. I mean, it still has this reputation as, the first lasting English colonial settlement. It still has a lot of prestige, but it's no longer the mother of presidents. It loses
mhm,
population. The soil is wearing out. It's just not that big and important a place anymore. And, coastal South Carolina has that problem. The upcountry becomes very wealthy. But the coastal elites are not as rich as they used to be. They are no longer the rice princes. It's the cotton snobs that live towards the western part of the state that actually have the money.
mhm,
And then, but then seeing, how racing moved with the money. So it moved into Natchez
mhm,
because that part of Mississippi was unbelievably wealthy before the Civil War. I mean, the wealth was concentrated in only a few hands, but the richest Americans in 1861 live in and around Natchez. The people who were millionaires in 1861 dollars, which means they would be billionaires today,
mhm,
are a small number of cotton planters, the so-called Natchez nabobs.
mhm,
And they take up horse racing. And, it also goes to New Orleans after the so-called Americans take over, when New Orleans is no longer French, because the French don't seem to have a great deal of interest in horse racing, either in France or in its colonies at that
mhm,
time. But, New Orleans really promotes itself even before the Civil War as a tourist fantasia that, if you're from New York or you're from Paris, you can come to New Orleans, and, what happens in New Orleans stays in New Orleans. You can do business, you can buy art, but you can also,
mhm,
you can buy sex from, glamorous, expensive sex workers. You can eat incredibly rich
mhm,
food. You can be drunk in public and no one will judge you that harshly. And you can go to a very fancy racetrack.
mhm,
But then all of this comes to a screeching halt with the outbreak of the Civil War.
mhm,
And none of these tracks bounces back after the war. I mean, there is still horse racing, for example, in New Orleans, but it's a completely new foundation after the war. So where does the money go? The money is based around New York City
mhm,
and New York City's summer colony at Saratoga. So the people who lead racing are no longer, the Southern plantation
mhm,
gentry. They are now new money in New York, people who make money from speculation, or were enriched during the Civil War, often through government contracts. And on the one hand, they feel pretty confident because they are very, very rich. But they also feel a bit awkward because their money is brand new. And while they don't feel embarrassed in front of Virginia aristocrats because they think I could buy and sell this person a thousand times over, but in New York, they do feel a bit uncomfortable around the so-called Knickerbockers,
mhm,
old New York society.
mhm,
And so to show that they aren't just, rich new people with no manners, that they are cultured and glamorous, they take up horse racing, but the kind of horse racing they take up isn't really a variant of the pre-Civil War South. It's very English influenced
mhm,
because to them, aristocracy is not a South Carolinian with a burned down plantation. It is, you know, someone, from the literal
mhm.
aristocracy,
Yeah.
mostly of England.
Okay. No, and go ahead. Sorry.
And then finally, I look at Kentucky because, is Kentucky the South? We could debate that for a long time. But Kentucky, before the Civil War, has outstanding horse breeding, all the best horses,
Hmm.
other than a small number that are uh, imported from Britain. The best horses are Kentuckian bred horses. But Kentucky racing is not really very high standard. And people from out of state do not go to Kentucky races. But because Kentucky did not suffer the kind of damage that the other racing capitals of the South did, when they decide, it's really a bunch of civic boosters who think, we want to be an important city. And part of being an important city is attracting a lot of tourists. Well, what can we do that we have that attracts tourists? Well, we could have racing. But a man named Meriwether Lewis Clark who is a city father of uh, Louisville, is sent off to London for a year to learn how the English do racing and to bring those practices back. But at the same time, you know, rather weirdly, as Nina Silber has discussed in her book, The Romance of Reunion, even just a decade
Hmm.
after the Civil War, there are a lot of Northerners, including men who had fought in the Union Army, who are actually very charmed by the South, now that it's no longer seen as threatening in economic or
Hmm.
military terms. So, people actually want to go and live out this, moonlight and magnolias fantasy as tourists. So even though Louisville is actually a booming modern city
Hmm.
that, in some sense, is pretty much an adjunct of Ohio across the river. It was never, as devoted to plantation agriculture as much of the South was. But the city boosters decide that what's going to make their racetrack really appealing and get people to travel long distances is let's sell them a mythology of the Old South, of the Kentucky Colonel, of the faithful black servant, of the mint julep, and the garland of roses around the winter's neck, and singing My Old Kentucky Home, a Stephen Foster song that is actually ventriloquized through the enslaved. So that's where we end up with new style racing, popularized in Britain and taken up by New Yorkers, but being given this kind of scrim of Old South gentility to be sold to tourists. So that's where I end.
That was like a mic drop, end of the book.
And my original plan, although I didn't really do it, was that I was going to end when um, Leonard Jerome Jr., the cousin of, no, I'm sorry, he's the uncle of Winston Churchill,
Oh.
because Winston Churchill's mother was Jenny Jerome from Brooklyn, New
Hmm.
York. And Jenny was the daughter of Leonard Jerome Sr., a big financier who was very active in racing. And Leonard Jerome Jr. Starts a racetrack in the early 20th century on Long Island. And he buys the gate posts that had stood since the 1790s at the Charleston racetrack and were an important symbol to racing people. And
Right.
after the Civil War, the Charlestonians try to revive the racetrack, but they don't have the money, they don't have the horses, and they decide that rather than limping on pathetically, they're going to do the right thing and pull the plug.
Hmm.
But Mr. Jerome asks to buy the gateposts to stand at the entrance to his new track, and the executors of the Charleston Jockey Club say, "You cannot buy them from us, we will give them to you." So here's this moment of transit from the old South world of racing to this new 20th century world. But it's interesting, I think, both that Jerome, this New Yorker, who probably had never been to South Carolina, and certainly had never been before the war because he was a small child, thinks it's very important to get these gates.
Hmm.
And the last thing that the Charleston Jockey Club can say, yes, we will let you have the gates, but it's not like you're buying them from us because we're pathetic and poor. We are giving them to you because we think you will be a good custodian of them.
Well, I suppose the track doesn't exist anymore, so
No. So I don't know where the gates are now. They may still be there.
oh well, okay, that there's something good then still at least. Yeah, but that's I think you nicely summarized why I greatly enjoyed the book because you kind of bring all these different facets of US history together in the history of racing. Sorry, I should be specific in this now that, because we do have race eventually too that we want to maybe talk about a little bit and how race impacts racing culture. But it's just so fascinating how you have all these different parts that are just coming through in this. And uh, while you were talking, so I kind of started thinking of like, how much is American horse racing influenced by Britain? Obviously, with Saratoga and New York, you're saying it's very much, but how much of the early racing is English influenced?
So before the American Revolution, to the extent that it was possible, the Virginians and South Carolinians did want to replicate English practices because what could be better than imitating the ways of English elites? But of course, after the American Revolution, that was not very popular. To say, this is just like England was not what you wanted to be saying. So there really is a change, not just in terms of, talking about England, but uh, by the beginning of the 19th century, the English tracks had switched to the kind of races we see today, the short dash, where it's only one heat and the horses run a mile, perhaps a mile and a half. Whereas American racing up to just before the Civil War does something very different. It has these races which usually have three heats. So you have to run three times to win. And each of the sub races is a 2.5 miles.
Ooh.
So a horse that can run fast over a mile course versus a horse that can run three times over one that's at least 2 miles, those are
Mm,
different kinds of horses.
right.
So a lot of the complaints today about modern racing, and one of the reasons I don't like it, is that the kind of horse that wins today is a very young horse,
Mhm,
a very light horse,
mhm,
physically quite small. I mean, they don't look small when you're next to them, but they are comparatively small.
mm,
And one reason that horses wear out fast is that they're not really full grown. And,
mhm,
so many of them snap a limb and have to be shot trackside. uh they're overbred because you can
mhm,
only be a thoroughbred if you come from one of three foundation sires. So they've just been bred in and bred in again, and they're bred for speed. But if you think about these early 19th century American horses, they are bigger, older horses.
mhm,
They're running, nobody would run a 3-year-old in 1820. They would say it's not
mm,
ready to run. It's a baby.
right.
They start later, but they keep running later because unless they're unlucky, they don't wear out so fast. And think about these horses. I mean, not only do they have to run these long races, but how do you get your horse from one track to one in another state? Especially if you're inland before
Right.
the railroads, it walks there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it has to be a quite robust animal. It may
Mhm,
never pull a plow or a
mm,
carriage, but it is still quite a sturdy beast.
mhm. Yeah. Oh
and
wow.
and,
Yeah.
and it's a bigger animal and it's more solid. Um, so the idea, of course, you wanted a fast horse because the way you win races is by get
Mm,
running the fastest. But the ideal American horse before in the 19th century up to the Civil War is a horse that is the right blend of speed and what they then called bottom.
mm,
That horse has bottom was a great compliment. That meant it has stamina.
mm,
There were sprinters and stayers, and the English
mhm.
liked sprinters, but the Americans liked stayers.
Okay.
And they felt that, they called it 2.25 miles was the noble distance. And the idea was that, any horse, if it's, the right kind of horse, and if you spur it and whip it, can run fast. But, a really splendid horse is a horse that can pace itself and its
Mm,
jockey can So it's much more of a test of man and animal. And I actually quite believe that.
Yeah.
Not only because it is a lot healthier for the horse,
Hmm.
but also it really if you don't just go out of the gate sprinting because you're only going to go a mile, you have to think about, especially if you have to have three races in the same day. How do you pace the
Pacing.
horse? How do you restore the
Yeah.
horse between the races so it can get out there and run again?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I was thinking like reference to like modern athletes, right? If you've been a gymnast since five and then you win your gold medal at like 18, yeah, by 2021, you're used up. Yeah. Your body can't handle it anymore. It's
Yeah, well, actually, it's encouraging that at least American women gymnasts now do tend to be they go on longer and they have more solid muscled bodies.
hmm
They're not these little wraiths that they used to be. And so you have someone like Simone Biles, who what is she like 26 or 27, and she's still a world champion. And although she's about would come up to about my elbow, I mean she's a wall of muscle.
Yeah. Yeah.
It doesn't look like, she has little arms that are going to break. Same for the horses. I mean, I think,
Yeah.
and I think Secretariat maybe was the great um outsider on that because, even though he could run extremely fast and he did, I think he
Mhm.
could have been a stayer.
Mm.
Not because he was a very big horse.
Hmm.
When he was autopsied, apparently his heart was literally three times as large as a normal horse heart. So he actually was a kind of perfect aerobic machine. And you see him, if you ever watch a video of him, you'll see that, when he finishes the race, he wants to keep going. And his rider wants to really pull back to say, no, we're all finished. He's like, I could go another time. So I think it really was, much more exciting kind of racing.
That almost reminds me of my dog. You walk 2 miles with him and he's like, well, we can go another two. And like, no, I'm down. I'm tired. But that kind of leads sort of naturally almost, like, even though he's fairly late in the book, I feel like to Richard Tenbrook, right? Because he's that New Orleans figure to kind of revolutionize and change the racing touch, but he goes to the UK and comes back and he seems or he felt like he appeared in a couple different places in your book, but he felt like sort of the one of the people that helps with that sort of transitioning, that transatlantic bridging of the sport.
Richard Tenbrook is definitely my favorite person that I've written about. Like me, he's from Albany, New York.
Oh.
He's from an old bourgeois Dutch family that had been in
Mhm.
the US a long time, even when he's born in the 1820s. He goes to West Point, but he gets kicked out in his first year for fighting with one of his instructors. His
Okay.
family are pretty disgusted. So he lights out for the territories. He becomes a Mississippi riverboat gambler. And he makes a lot of money. But he decides, that's a young man's game, but you don't want to spend your whole life on these boats, having to sleep on top of your valise of money so someone doesn't steal it from you. And he's interested in horse racing, so he kind of does an apprenticeship with my other favorite guy, Colonel William Johnson. Colonel
Mhm.
William is, the Virginia planter, and he is really, Mr. American Turf in the Jacksonian era. So Tenbrook, this Dutch Yankee, you know, basically follows Johnson around all the southern tracks and learns all that Johnson knows about breeding and training and racing horses. And then Tenbrook decides, all right, it's time for me to do my own thing. So he goes to New Orleans and he sets up the Metairie Racetrack, which is you can actually still see the outline. It's now a cemetery. It's near the airport in New Orleans on the highway between the city and the airport.
That was fascinating, by the way.
And he decides that he's going to, on the one hand, offer fabulous horse sport, but he's also going to offer all the things that people like in New Orleans: fancy food, the finest wines, the most glamorous and discreet sex workers, but also a ladies' lounge where the respectable ladies can sit without, having to deal with the hoi polloi.
Mhm.
But he also gets very obsessed with speed.
Mhm.
So they still have the longer races and the heats, but he really draws attention to Metairie by having these so-called match races, where rather than having half a dozen or a dozen horses just entered by their owners, you will have, the best horse of several different states
Mm,
competing, or sometimes it's just one against the other. And there's a huge amount of betting. So, that's very good for the track because so many
mm,
people come and so many people will bet.
mm,
But there, it really is an emphasis on, um, obviously one horse will win, but not just who wins, but are they going to set a record?
mm,
Part of this is technologies of timekeeping are you're getting, watches and clocks are getting more sophisticated. So you don't just say, well, horse A, got past the post faster than horse B, which anyone can see, but you can say, well, he was exactly, 1.5 seconds ahead, and he set a national record.
mm,
There's a lot of fascination with that. And so then, just a few years before the Civil War, Ten Brook is a restless kind of guy. He
mm,
likes to keep moving around. So he says, we're all interested in what's going on the English turf. And some of those people on the English turf are saying that American horses aren't really good. As one commentator wrote, they're all fudge, which I really liked. So I'm going to take the best horses of America and I'm going to run them at all of the top
mm,
English races, and we'll see who
mm,
comes out on top. And this is referred to by the racing papers as the American invasion.
mm.
And so,
Reverse
there's
invasion
a lot
once.
of interest and from both the American and the British press. And here's this, this Yankee who's coming over and he's going to try to beat the English at their own game. He does actually very poorly. A couple of the horses, I mean, taking horses on a long sea voyage is not recommended for their health. So some of them are sick, one dies, and they don't do tremendously well on the track. There's even a rumor that Ten Brook is betting on them to lose. That's not necessarily substantiated. And then he kind of gets stuck there because the Civil War breaks out. So
Mhm,
there's not going to be any racing in Metairie. And while he could take a boat for New York, he doesn't see any reason to do
mhm,
so. But he does hang out with, the racing fancy of England likes him a lot. One
mhm,
commentator said he's the sort of shrewd, dry American that we read about, in novels. So, he's actually very popular. He's
mhm,
quite a clubbable guy, and his Americanness is actually seen as quite charming and different. And people they like the fact that he knows a lot about horses, and he
mhm,
and he seems quite willing to learn. So, he does come back. He does become an advisor to some of these rich post-Civil War New Yorkers
mhm,
who set up breeding and racing stations. And in his later life, he ends up out in Southern California at the Santa Anita track,
mhm,
because racing is just making its way out all the way to the West. And he dies, I think, in his 80s in California. He's out of money and he's seen as someone who's kind of outlived his time. He's an
mhm,
interesting historical relic. And he's surrounded by his old racing trophies,
mhm.
although he does get buried in the cemetery at Louisville. His second wife was from Kentucky. But he is quite a fascinating guy. I mean, because he really tells the whole story of 19th century American racing from when it was still a very vernacular Southern sport, into this world of British racing and then post-Civil War American sport.
Yeah. Well, and I like
Sadly,
him.
no personal papers that I've ever been able to discover. And there are hardly even any images of him, considering he was a pretty famous person.
Oh, wow, that sucks.
Quite a fascinating guy.
Yeah, no, maybe somebody can find it for you. Some
Yeah, maybe
genealogist said
maybe
X.
Ten Brook. Next time I go back to Albany, I mean, Ten Brook is a
Yeah,
very name there. There's a Ten Brook mansion from the 18th century that you get taken to when you're a small child on your school field trips. So maybe there may be some Ten Brooks around, and maybe they have some papers.
yeah, well, that would be fun. He sounds like a really fun character to write a biography
Apparently, he
about.
also was known. I mean, he was apparently a very, friendly and likable man.
Yeah.
But apparently he had these icy blue eyes, and if you were playing cards
Mhm.
against him,
The total poker face.
And that he was I don't think he was accused. I mean, as far as I know, he was, an honest gambler. He wasn't a cheat, but
Yeah.
he was a wicked man with a pack of cards, a lot of money. And so he's definitely a guy that, was born high and but likes to go between,
Right.
the heights and depths of the
Yeah.
social. He can be socializing with British aristocrats at the London Jockey Club.
Mhm.
But he also enjoyed going up and down the Mississippi on these riverboats and getting up to all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
So quite
Uh,
a picturesque character.
and there were so many things in your answers there that I found as I read through so fascinating that spoke to so many aspects of the book and the racing culture. But I think one of the things that struck me the most, having, as I said earlier, been in New Mexico for 2 years, and there was a racetrack, and we had again the races in town for about 8 to 10 weeks, where you say in a number of places, this is just a couple of days a year where this racetrack is actually being used. So that was like, wow, I did not expect that this is just this once a year or twice a year weekend event.
So even the really high-end racing, so up to the Civil War, it is the Washington course in Charleston is really considered, maybe it doesn't have the
Mm,
biggest prizes, but it is really elegant.
yeah.
You know,
And you have some pictures which actually show that really nice.
and it is a place where, you could bring grandma and grandma would not be upset by rude people behaving badly. Ladylike women can go there. And it's tied in with the Saint Cecilia Ball and all of these old
Mm,
Charlestonian elite recreations. And the people of the Charleston Jockey Club are very wealthy men, and they put a lot of their own money into this every
mm,
year. I mean, it's a year-round racetrack, and they have to keep
mm,
it up all year. But there's only a few weeks each year, even at its
mm,
height. I forgot the Latin, but there was a quotation from one of the members in the 19th century that said, we shouldn't have our recreations too often because we would grow bored with them. So if we had racing in Charleston 6 months out of the year, it wouldn't
mm,
be elite, it wouldn't be delightful, and lots of people wouldn't even bother going anymore. But because
mm,
we only have it a few weeks out of the year, then it's very exciting. Then everybody wants to go. And particularly Race Week in February was the Carnival of the South, as one newspaper called it. So people are going and they are drinking and betting, but it's also a big marriage market for elite
mm,
Southerners, or a place where people go because they want to do some business or get
mm,
something passed by the legislature. Everybody's going to be at the racetrack. Everybody's going to be in a good mood and jovial and
mhm.
relaxed. And then there will be all of the other parties and the race ball, which is considered the greatest moment of the South Carolina social scene. And so this is where you get stuff done.
Yeah. No, and that was the part that was interesting about all of your plays is that it just there was this very close relationship, it seemed, between the community and the racetracks, that they kind of very much built on each other and that they kind of symbiotically needed each other for success.
And I think that's one of the problems that racetracks have had in the 20th and 21st century is that
Mm,
in most places that link no longer exists. It does in Saratoga. And
mhm.
that is what allows Saratoga to continue as it does. It does in some ways in at um sorry, I just completely blanked. The Kentucky Derby ground. What is it called?
And Churchill,
Churchill Downs.
Churchill Downs.
Although that is so much, about international celebrity at this
Yeah.
point. But I mean, Baltimore, I mean, has had racing since the 1880s, but
Mm,
I mean, and there all are some old Baltimoreans who were like, "Oh, I grew up going to the track. My parents
mm,
took the track," but there really isn't a very strong sense of, one thing about being a Baltimorean is you go to Pimlico Racetrack. There just is, I mean, people, but it's because the track has gotten very dilapidated because the
mm,
area in which it's located, some people think is, maybe where you don't want to leave your car parked.
mm.
That's accurate or not, but it's just not a sort of great Baltimorean thing. Lots of people grow up in Baltimore, and have never been to Pimlico, and their parents didn't go to Pimlico. And so, it's lost, its link.
Mm.
And that's true in so many places.
Yeah, well, I guess there's also the replacement, right? That people today are more like, oh, I went to the football game in town or the baseball game in town, that it has more
Yeah,
interests these days. Mm.
that local link is going to be with whether it's a football team, baseball team, basketball team, in some places maybe a hockey
Yeah,
team. But yeah, if you're in Baltimore, you have to go watch the Orioles,
yeah,
and maybe you go watch the Ravens. But
right.
it takes it's really it's most places that still have racetracks, they're not seen as synonymous with the city.
Yeah. Sort of the add-on, the kind of appendix.
Only for people either on special occasions like the Preakness Stakes, or for a very small group of people that just really like horse racing.
Yeah. Um, Gambling. We have to talk about gambling because it was such a fascinating, like, we need it, we want it, but we really don't want it. It's not really morally right. It seemed like no one really wanted it most times, but they all tolerated it because they knew it makes money and brings
Well, there's
people.
gambling and gambling. So if you are a Virginia gentleman and you
Hmm.
have a horse racing, and your friend is a Virginia gentleman, he's got a horse racing, it's
Hmm.
perfectly right to make a bet with him. Well, I think my horse is going to win. Well, I think my horse is going to win, and we'll find out, and somebody will have to pay somebody else. That's perfectly acceptable because you're really doing it. It's about friendship and honor, and also your ability to really know the horses.
Right.
But if you're just doing it to make money,
Mm,
that's when it's bad.
mm,
So there, the term that kept coming up in the pre-Civil War parts of the book is blackleg.
yeah.
And a blackleg is a semi-professional gambler.
Mm,
Blacklegs love racetracks, but
mm,
they may not care at all about racing. They
mm,
just go because that is a venue in which they can make money. So they're seen as either rich layabouts who
mm,
are misusing their wealth, or people who aren't rich but won't get a real job. So it's very bad to have too many blacklegs at your course because that means it's unrespectable, and
mm,
the respectable men and certainly the women are
mm,
not going to want to come to such a place because it's sort of sleazy.
mm,
Even if the blackleg is well dressed, even if he has good manners, there's still the idea that he is inherently a sleazy kind of a guy. But you then how do you finance these places? So if you have, a group of
mm,
Charlestonian gentlemen who are wealthy and they don't mind subsidizing the place, you
mm,
can get along without betting, or where betting is just person to person, it doesn't actually go to the track. It's just Mr. X betting with Mr. Y.
mm,
It was even all right under those circumstances for women to bet, but they couldn't do so for money. So, a young lady and her fiance could bet, but she could bet with pairs of gloves or, boxes of chocolates, not with cash. And children could be inducted into betting, but again,
mm,
grandpa would bet you, a
mm,
toy, something. So making a wager itself is not bad,
mm,
but it's anything where you just want money. You don't actually care if your horse wins, except that it will bring you money, but you just pick the horse that has the best
mm,
odds and hope that you're going to get some cash out of it. But then, people like gambling. And,
mm,
if you're going to run a bigger track that isn't just, gathering in the local gentry, then you have to offer people stuff to do. And one thing that people really like to do is gambling. And if you're going to have all of these bookmakers, then you really want a piece of the action yourself if you run the track. So
mm,
then you get, sponsored betting. You get the parimutuels, Saratoga does this a lot. And this is how racetracks mostly make their money. It's not really by selling
mm,
food and drink. It's by, cutting in on the
mm.
gambling. But, Americans go back and forth about this, and certainly, there are many places where, I mean, New England in particular, which is one reason why New England never really gets racing in a serious way. But even in the South,
Oh.
there are plenty of religious
Mm.
people who think, it is wrong. And, and plenty of people who, I mean, were some old Charlestonians who got very angry when the winner of a track, or rather the of a race, or rather the person who owned the winning horse would get a financial prize for their
Mm.
victory. They said, no, it should be the old way where they just got a silver plate. And yes, in
Okay.
theory, you could sell your silver plate, but of course you wouldn't, because you were a gentleman. And you would just have the silver plates on display in your home so people would know what a great turfman you were. But the idea of rewarding success with money was
Mm.
considered very vulgar, and some people would no
Mm.
longer race their horses in Charleston because they didn't like that practice. So there's this whole pull between the amateur and the professional.
Mm.
And, Americans eventually do decide, actually, we like gambling. Uh, Um, we like face-to-face gambling. Of course, it takes a long
Mm.
time. But, Americans don't like, I mean, other than in Las Vegas, there are very few places in the US until really the end of the 20th century where you can legally gamble. I mean, you
Mhm.
can have off-track betting,
Yeah.
but having casinos in places that aren't Las Vegas is really late 20th century. So there's still the idea that, okay, you can gamble, but you have to actually go to the place, the real place,
Mm.
and put your money down, not just, sit at home. And then of course we get the internet. But the story of gambling in America is a long and complicated one.
Yeah, and you're about to go to New Orleans where it's a
Yes.
really fascinating gambling culture
And
with
then of
the
course we've had the whole thing with Native Americans,
yeah, native
tribes
casinos.
running casinos, and
Mm.
now of course you never have to go to a casino at all, or even an off-track betting office. You can just do it all online.
Yeah. Yeah, it's internet has revolutionized everything of how to lose your money. Um, and it it is sort of a you kind of mentioned the terminology, right? Respectability, and that's very often what sort of was what seemed to be at stake in these sort of early racetracks, and especially kind of the individuals who you then attracted because it was like so when I have to picture a racetrack at this time, and you say you kind of said that you have the gender sort of separated in their own stands. So do I have to like imagine like there's a men's stands, there's a women's stands, and then there's sort of like general spectators sitting in the grass, or
Yeah.
what?
So if you
How
want to
do I
sit
picture
in
this?
So, at some racetracks, there would only be one stand, and in theory, women could go to the stand, but that wasn't respectable. So, really elite women are just sitting in their
Hmm.
carriages at some distance from the track, so they
Oh.
can see the track, but people can't really see them, and
Hmm.
they go between one another's carriages. But eventually, track owners say, "Well, if we want to really get a lot of women, well, why do we want women? Well, first of all, the presence of women shows that the track is respectable." And secondly, the more women we get, especially younger, pretty, unmarried women, a lot of men will come to the track just because
Hmm.
it's a way to meet with, or see women.
Right.
So we're going to have to make a ladies' stand, and also like a ladies' parlor, and a place to do
Hmm.
their hair. So there's a lot of emphasis on that. For people who are not going to sit in the stands because they're not of that social or economic group,
Hmm.
yeah, people will be mixed, and there probably will be even some free people of color.
Hmm.
And enslaved people generally couldn't really go in on their own recognizance. They might be
Hmm.
attending their owners. But certainly, there's a lot of discussion of enslaved people sitting on the fences, or surging around the gates,
Hmm.
and of betting among themselves if they had a little bit of money. And of course, before the Civil War, almost every jockey in America was a man or boy of
Hmm.
color, and the majority of them were enslaved. And that's something that's changes very quickly in the
Hmm.
last 20th century. In the first Kentucky Derby, um, in the 1870s, all of the jockeys were black men. some of them
Mm,
former slaves. By the beginning of the 20th century, there are hardly any black
mm,
jockeys. And I think the last black man to ride in the Kentucky Derby for almost a century, it was in 1913. So, there is just this complete replacement. There's
yeah.
still a lot of black men who are with their grooms and trainers,
Hmm.
or stable hands, or they're selling food or taking
Right.
tickets. But it turn white Northern America people from the North,
Mm,
just as they don't really like to have black house servants,
mm,
they don't really like to see black jockeys.
right.
So jockeys became almost exclusively white for most of the 20th century. And now it's starting to mix a bit more. And also, there are a lot of Latin American jockeys now,
Mm,
and some Filipino. And
mm,
that has less to do with race and more about the fact that, jockey weights have not gone up very
hmm.
significantly, but it's very hard to find a boy, a teenage boy or a man that can keep their weight. I mean,
Hmm.
even, men who are short and fairly small built don't weigh 115 pounds.
Right. Right.
I mean, it's hard to really find many adult males that are under maybe 140 pounds.
Mm,
And, even people who look quite small, I mean, often, their weight is higher than that.
mhm.
So, but
Mm,
some men from some parts of, Central America, from the
mhm,
Philippines, you are getting smaller built men that can keep
mhm.
the weights down.
Yeah. Oh,
As both
fascinating.
white American and black American men, you just
Yes.
aren't going to find that many
Yeah.
very thin. And it's very hard because on the one hand, you have to be very, very thin. And
Hmm.
if you're 1 ounce over your weight, you won't ride.
Right.
But you have to be strong. So how can you get someone who is strong enough to control this big animal,
Hmm.
but who isn't going to
Right.
weigh more than 115 pounds?
I did wonder while you were talking, so because you said that in the pre-Civil War, like pre-British racing coming to the US, it was like you did 3 races of 2 miles, which means your horse is stronger, your horse is tougher. Was that maybe also a factor that because the race culture is changing, that impacts that you want a lighter jockey instead of like you have a stronger horse, it can carry a stronger man.
I haven't read anything about that.
Oh,
And I mean, these very small boys and men were riding these bigger
hmm.
horses, able to ride them.
Right.
So, but of course, there wasn't as much sprinting going on.
Hmm.
And it's a good question, but it really has become a problem for racing that, it is simply
Hmm.
not easy to get. I mean, yeah, I mean, obviously, one thing to do would be, well, you just have to raise the weights. You have to say that, a man can be 135 pounds or
Hmm.
140 and get more people. But then, of course, that will slow I mean, I suppose part of it was before timing, you could win, but people weren't really thinking about setting records. And as long as
Hmm.
you were ahead of the horse ahead behind you, you were a winner. But when you start getting an obsession with record setting,
No.
um, you don't want anything to potentially slow down the horse when it's all sprint.
Right.
So
Yeah.
the tenth of a second is precious. And if your rider weighs an extra 5 pounds,
Hmm.
that may be the difference between, winning the Kentucky Derby and coming in fifth.
Right. Yeah. Well, I guess we found first candidates for the gold card that the US government is issuing for immigrants.
Yeah, I don't think I'm not sure that Trump's I don't know whether he'd be a racing fan. And he probably would quite like, being at the Kentucky Derby and having everyone,
Wave, yeah. And then the
come
Latin
along, give
American
him a
jockeys. Oh God. That aside. Um, yeah, so jockeys was definitely something I was thinking about too that but you kind of drawing towards the end of your book, you do talk about the kind of the lack of centralization with regard to American horse racing, racing culture, sort of organization. And you kind of introduced the jockey club, I think it was called. And that seemed to help a little bit with sort of centralization. And it felt like it was happening at the same time that you see this monopolization around the country with industry too.
And it's some of the same people.
Ah, well, that helps.
So, I mean, England had the jock, and they just called it the Jockey Club. It was essentially the
Mm,
London Jockey Club, but that started in the 1750s.
mm,
So Britain has very centralized racing quite a bit
mm,
earlier. But I mean, people liked the locality. They liked the
mm,
idea that you know this track is run by this group of local men
mm,
who are the Jockey Club of the locality, and there were dozens or probably hundreds in the pre-Civil War
mm,
South. Every little town wants to have its, if it has any pretensions
mm,
to be any kind of place of repute, you got to have a jockey club.
mm,
Men say, I'm not some backwoods planter, I'm a gentleman. How do I know I'm a gentleman? Maybe I don't have a library, maybe I'm not very educated, maybe I don't care about paintings, but I'm the jockey club, and that means I'm a gentleman.
mm,
And so certainly there was the idea of being part of one of these little groups, and you didn't have to be that rich or that
mm,
prominent. But then there are all these complaints. There is this there are these problems with a lot of illegal behavior, a lot of sleaze, and the sense of these kind of self-appointed guardians of
mm,
virtue that unless we get this under control, racing is just going to become associated with very unsavory people. So it's very New York based, and it is
mm,
these captains of industry, who want to think of themselves as I'm not. I mean, just like someone like Henry Clay Frick, was a really quite rapacious robber baron, but he could think of himself as I'm not just that guy that sends in thugs to beat up the strikers. I
mm,
have a lovely art collection.
mm,
And when he dies, he leaves, he sets up a museum so that
mm,
everyone can see his lovely paintings. So, people, they want to be rich and they're quite happy to be
mm,
very hard-nosed, but there is, and then certainly, I do see this rather contrast to today that,
mm,
the robber barons of the late 19th century were incredibly rapacious. But whether it was that they were just competing to who could be more charitable, or who could
mm,
be do more for the wider community, or whether they feared God's judgment after death, that if you just get rich, maybe
mm,
you aren't that good a person.
mm,
So they say, well, we are the people that have the knowledge and the
mm.
reputation, and we are going to make sure that racing is run properly.
Yeah, at least they had something of a consciousness.
I mean, they love their sport, and they didn't
Yeah.
want it to be overtaken by a tide of,
Hmm.
sleep and sharp practice. So it took a while to really bed in, but I mean, now
Mm,
if you're not recognized by the jockey club, you really aren't a real track.
mm,
As a breeder, as a trainer, as an
mm,
owner,
mm,
as a track manager, you want the imprimatur of the jockey club.
mm. Well, it also fits again, sort of the national themes, right? That pre-Civil War, the nation is much more fragmented, states' rights questions, and then after the Civil War, you kind of nationalize, and the
And there's also
nation
a lot
has.
more rivalry. So, to say that,
Mm,
our Kentucky horse beat your Louisiana horse is very important to people before the Civil War.
yes.
Whereas, afterwards, it's really more, I mean, there are celebrity horses, but people like them because they win a lot or they're
Hmm.
unusual in some way, whether it's Seabiscuit or Secretariat or War Admiral or any of the great 20th century
Mm,
horses. People aren't identifying them with where were they born and where were they bred and who owns them. It really is about that horse is great.
right. Yeah.
Is it, I don't think we've had celebrity horses in a long time. I'm just old enough
Mm,
to vaguely remember Secretariat mania, and that all
mm,
sorts of people who didn't care at all about horses and had never been to a race were talking about Secretariat all the time. And, was he
mm,
going to win all three races in the Triple Crown? And wasn't he
mm.
incredible?
Yeah, it
And
feels like most.
where everybody knew about him, and everybody,
Mm,
you could buy Secretariat T-shirts, and and even in a pre-social media world,
mm,
unless you were living under a rock in America, you had heard of Secretariat.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if it's sort of like because you mentioned earlier that the kind of treatment of horses is so much worse these days that maybe that sort of impacts it. You just don't have a run anymore that lasts long enough for you to
Yeah,
kind of
I think
make it for
there's this
years.
cynicism and this also more of an awareness of doping
Yeah.
and and thinking, are these horses actually having a very good time?
Mm, yeah.
I suppose in the same way that we've gotten, cynical about, the way we used to really, revere, anyone who was in the Olympics.
Yeah. And now we're singing doping immediately, right? Like,
We wonder about, what's really going on. And, we still do, venerate, Simone Biles or Michael Phelps or, a few,
yeah.
of the really outstanding ones, the
Hmm.
ones that, yeah, I don't
But
think there's been a horse that has caught Americans' fancy. And in
mm,
Secretariat, that's almost 50 years ago.
yeah. Ooh, time
But
for a good horse to rise.
but if you, I mean, but if you're ever having a bad day, I recommend going on YouTube and watching him at the Belmont Stakes.
Oh, okay.
It's really remarkable. He and his jockey were very good at pacing, so he doesn't come out front for a while. He's just in the middle, and then he's slowly moving up, and then he's kind of neck and neck for a bit with a horse called Sham, who any other year would have been a champion, but poor Sham was always overshadowed by Secretariat. So, but again, Secretary does not seem like he's in any kind of a hurry. He's like just kind of riding around here. We're cool.
Hmm.
And then he makes his move and he pulls out and he's a length ahead and then he's about 3 lengths ahead. And then the camera crew has to keep pulling back so they can keep Secretariat in shot with all the other horses. He is basically running his own race. He gets so far out, and meanwhile, the crowd is going completely mad because they know they're seeing something very unusual. The sportscaster is also kind of melting down. He screams, "He's running like a tremendous machine!" And when I think he beats the others by, is it 26 lengths? I mean, it's just crazy. That you can barely see the other horses. They're completely in another race. And Secretary, he gets through the post and he's like, I can keep going. Want to keep going? And his rider's like, no, no, I'm pulling you up. And people just are completely melting down.
I
And
was
they're,
like, can I run another race to beat them a second time?
yeah, you feel like I could catch them again. But people are just, whether they had any money on Secretary, I don't think it matters. I think they were just like, I have seen something truly
Right.
historic. And also
Yeah.
the sense that this horse seems to be running in a rather joyous way. And
Hmm.
his jockey later said, I never spurred him and I never whipped him. I just sat on him and didn't get in his way. I didn't have to do anything. I never had to convince
Hmm.
him he wanted to run. He just ran.
Yeah.
And I
Well,
tried not to fall off.
that would be bad. That
It
would
would
be
be
really
bad.
bad. Yeah, no, that's what you want, right? You want a horse that enjoys it rather than being forced to it. Um, so towards the end now,
Yeah.
Churchill Downs. We do have to talk about that lost cause nostalgia, Confederate heaven. You already mentioned it a little bit, but it just it feels like so out of place selling a mythology.
Well, especially because antebellum Kentucky, I mean, it did have slavery, it did have
Yeah, yeah,
plantations, but not to the same extent as most of the former
yeah,
Confederate states. But the people of Louisville were just good at figuring out, what do people want? What's going to get people in here? Why do they want to come here? And I do find it very weird that so many men who had personally been in the Union Army and were very happy to defeat the Confederacy, but even 10 years later,
yeah.
uh, I forgot what the famous phrase is, captive Greece it's captor captured or something like that. So
Hmm.
whether it's men in the Union Army who remain in the South, as part of the military occupation, but who marry Southern belles. And there are a lot of novels about that, but it actually happened as well. Or it's people, rich Northerners who decide that they want to go to some of the Virginia Springs resorts, and which
Hmm.
because they're really quite shabby and basic as
Mm,
compared to much fancier places that you can go in the north. But pe people start saying even Saratoga is, oh, the bad kind of people. All those the new money is here, and women
mm,
who wear diamonds at breakfast, and it's all about extravagance. So we'll go to these rundown resorts where you'll meet the good people of the
mm,
South. And Robert E. Lee would go to them in the summer, and all these people, these
mm,
Northerners wanted to meet Robert E. Lee
right.
and to sit at his dinner table. So there really is this sense. On the one hand, they don't regret their
Mm,
they don't regret emancipation, but they do have this sense that, well, the North is very noisy and commercial and urban,
mm,
and that's good because it's wealthy and prosperous. But you know, maybe we did, maybe there is some charm to the Southern lifestyle. And white Southerners are very good at selling that to white Northerners. I mean,
mm,
I'd say they're still doing it today.
yeah. Yeah. Well, when you say that, it's like it's in 1870s, 1880s where they're doing it. Like it would make perfect sense, like 1930s after Gone with the Wind, right? Of like
Yeah, and it does
selling it
become
after
more
such a
intense,
blockbuster.
starting around the 1910s. It really is a full-on, let's sell those tourists the old South in any way we can. But even in the 1890s, there's a very popular series of books by a woman called Annie Fellows Johnston, who nobody reads today. But she wrote all of these books, particularly about the little colonel, who was actually a girl. She was played by, they were made into movies with Shirley Temple in the 1930s, but the books were older. And her
Mm,
books sold all over the country. And it basically was about a little girl whose mother was Southern, her father was from the North. And I think her mother was a widow. And so she takes the little girl from New York and they move to Grandpa's old plantation.
mm,
And, Grandpa at first is very crusty because, he hated the girl's northern father, but he really falls in love with his granddaughter.
mm,
And she loves living in the South.
mm,
And, these were popular everywhere. I
mm,
mean, and that's why Shirley Temple
mm,
was set to star in them because, so many people had read these novels.
mm,
And, famously, it's where Shirley Temple dances with Bojangles Robinson. And this was very controversial
mm,
because even though she's about 9 years old, she's dancing with a black man. And at
mm,
one point, they dance holding hands.
mm,
But in the novels, he was obviously he was no longer enslaved, but he was the faithful black retainer to the old colonel,
mm, mm,
and
mm.
now looking after the granddaughter, and people just lap that stuff up. So
Yeah.
Gone with the Wind didn't create that; it just capitalized on the
Mm,
fact that people around the country and indeed
mm,
overseas really love that Moonlight and Magnolia stuff.
mhm. No, I certainly right. Like I'm not sure how it's in Britain, but I know in Germany it's like it's still like plantation tours and Gone with the Wind are still like huge to kind of think
Yeah, and
about like
Oxford
the
and
old
Cambridge,
South.
until I think the 80s or 90s, I mean, they have these balls and they have themes, and sometimes the theme was, Southern belles and beaux, or,
Mm,
that kind of thing. And, it is very popular. So, all the
mm,
stuff with singing My Old Kentucky Home and drinking the mint julep and wearing, not
mm,
antebellum costumes per se,
yeah.
but, men in their seersucker suits and women, with the big hats and the flowered dresses, and the fact that, you know, I mean, most of the clientele are white. Most of the people who make your drink or serve your food are black, and obviously, they are paid employees and choosing that work, and they probably make a lot of money in tips on a race day. But there is just this sort of there is something very plantation like about
Hmm.
it. The whole idea of the Kentucky Colonel, which who sells fried chicken the world round.
Yes. Yes. Don't we love it?
And the fact that Louisville wasn't the old South, and that the people who wanted racing were very much hard-nosed businessmen who said, we got to get some tourism around here. What do they like? Go find a thing that people like. So they weren't, necessarily particularly into the lost cause mythology. They just knew that it sold.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good business, right? That's what in many ways it became. It's a business rather than anything else. Um, to close, since we have to draw to ends at some point, even though it's a fascinating conversation, you seem very knowledgeable about modern racing just as much as you do about historic racing. So, A, how much is English horse racing different today from American horse racing? And what would be
Not
big ch not very, okay.
um, I mean, there really was a convergence, by the end of the 19th
Mm,
century, with the same kinds of practices.
mm,
So
eh,
everywhere is the short dash race, the kind
mm,
of inbred horse,
right,
the prevalence of gambling.
mm,
One difference, though, I would say, I mean, Britain still has quite a lot of racetracks.
mm-hmm,
So, and it is, I mean, there is stuff like Royal Ascot where it is wealthy people and celebrities and getting dressed
mm,
up. But for example, my next door neighbor for a number of years in Manchester, who was an older, well, he was kind of prosperous at the end of his life, but a working class man, every
mm,
day he would take his walk to get some exercise and he would go and put a bet down
mm.
on a horse. That was just part of his day, along with buying his newspaper.
Oh wow.
And I don't know if when he was younger or when his children were
Yeah.
younger, they actually went to tracks, but lots of people, I mean, there
Mm,
are a lot of not very glamorous
mm,
tracks in not particularly glamorous cities that
mm-hmm,
are, they're not going to get,
mm,
the finest horses, but they do have racing quite often.
mm,
So it is, but of course, this is kind of, I mean, Britain doesn't really have baseball, basketball. I mean, pretty much it has
mm,
soccer,
right.
which is the only really, huge mass sport that everybody talks about. And for some people, there's a lot of interest in rugby or cricket, but
Mm,
racing has hung on a lot more. I mean,
mm,
it is more, and every high street in Britain has one of a few um, chains of bookmakers, legal.
mm-hmm,
So there is the thing about putting down money, but also there are
mm,
lots of people who do go to races quite often, and
mm.
not just the ones that are fancy and reported in newspapers.
Well, I guess it's sort of also a difference in culture, right? Because in Britain, I would assume it's similar to what we have in Germany, is that it's sort of you have your local sports club and they have their football and then they have the rivalry with the town over and it's sort of like you're invested and then you have like different age groups to the adults and then and you don't really have that in the United States that you have sort of like you have your like college sports or you have your high school sports, but then for adults there's very little beyond fitness centers where you can actually be kind of in a team sport that you can compete with like town over stuff.
Yeah, I have to admit, I don't know that much because I've never been to a racetrack in Britain.
Yeah.
There are the few things like Ascot, like the Grand National at Aintree in Liverpool, which are all about getting dressed up and having a
Mm-hmm.
big day out, and there being celebrities or, of course, the royal family. I think Charles less so than his mother, but the royal family are completely horse mad, and the late Queen, owned horses, had trainers and breeders and went to the stables and was apparently very knowledgeable about all the horses she owned, and on her trips to the United States was very keen to go to races there.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
He's not. I don't know if many of the current royals are as into it, but it does. Certainly, there are many very elite people that are really into racing.
Mhm.
Some of whom would actually be the owners of horses.
Considering the price tag, you gotta be elite to do this.
But I don't think there are that many rich Americans that are that interested. I mean, someone would buy, I don't know, a yacht or something rather than buy a horse.
Yeah. It doesn't seem like a great investment.
Well, except there's stud fees. I mean,
It's
a horse that can't
true.
run anymore, that only runs for a year and that has terrible knees, you can still make a ton of money
Yeah, breeding. Yeah,
stud.
yeah.
And then that was true in the 19th century as well. So, you
Mm,
had lots and lots of ads, so Lexington, the great horse of the 1850s,
mm,
after he had about 15 years after his racing career, and when he was completely blind, but he was still a
yeah.
top stud, and his owners were making money hand over fist because
Mm.
they charged, I love this phrase, per leap. So you'd bring your mare and your checkbook and say, okay, $50 a leap. So you can imagine this elderly male horse leaping upon the female.
Okay. Well, that's a perfect image to
That's how
quote.
how, how baby where baby horses come from.
There we go. We skipped from the bees directly to the to the horses. Awesome. Well, but I need to walk my dogs now, so I
Having dinner.
really appreciate, yep, and dinner probably for you. I really appreciate you taking the
Well,
time today.
thanks so much. I'm really glad that you enjoyed the book, and
Yeah,
I enjoyed writing it. Well, most of the time,
yeah,
sometimes writing is painful, but I'm fairly happy with how it turned out, and I hope that other people will read it and like it too.
yeah. I hope so. As I said, it's really fascinating in the way it sort of brings the national narrative together through horse racing. And if any of the listeners are interested in this, it is Thoroughbred Nation, Making America at the Racetrack from LSU Press.
And bargain priced. It's in in hardcover.
Yeah.
It's only it's hardback and ebook, and the hardback is 39.95 US, which is pretty cheap by academic book
Mhm.
standards.
For the size of it too. Yeah, and has pictures. Well, then enjoy your trip to New Orleans in the
So much,
next
and
couple of days.
thank you very much for hosting me.
You are so welcome.